What was FDR's priority agenda, and what was the Wagner Act and its impact on working people according to the film? So these acts were put forth by President Roosevelt in an attempt to get us out of the Great Depression. And he did that by creating a lot of temporary jobs for people, a lot in industry, and building infrastructure, and a lot of our national parks and monuments came from people working during this era. And in 1935, the National Labor Relations Act was passed, and this put a lot of power into the hands of the workers and made them able to create unions and make a more stable environment to work in where they had more rights. So this gave them the right to unionize, which gave them more free speech in their working environments and much more rights. And by the year 1939, the majority of industrial employees had unionized, and this created the Fair Labor Standards Act, which created minimum wage and a law for hours you can work, and fixed a lot of the child labor laws, which created a much better environment for people to work in this time period. And for the rest of American history, it really improved a lot of the issues that were being faced by people not being treated fairly in their work environments. How did Roosevelt attempt to limit fear in the American public? So, first of all, he went on the radio more than any other president in history. Well, he was the first to do this. And he would talk with the American public about the issues and what he was going to do to solve them, which created a lot of ease and made people understand more what was going on. And he passed a lot of legislation that provided both like psychological and financial stability and relief to a lot of people who were working at this time. And he created the FDIC, which ensured bank deposits, Social Security, and Social Security really made Americans much less fearful of the future because it made them sure that they were going to be protected by their government if they were to lose their jobs or would become too old to work anymore. They would be able to retire and still have support by the government. So the Social Security Act really brought a lot of relief to people because they could be sure that their government was organized and their work was protected and organized in a way that was going to make them financially secure throughout their working days and after. Describe how blacks and Latinos were affected by the New Deal according to the film. So a lot of blacks felt they had someone on their side because a lot of the legislation extended to them as well. However, Social Security did not, so that was still something that had yet to extend to that community. And many politicians in the South did not want to see the labor laws extended to blacks in the South, so they weren't extended to farm labor, which was primarily black and Latino at that time, so they weren't covered by the Social Security or the Fair Labor Act or anything of that sort. Who was Frances Perkins, and what did she do in the Roosevelt administration? So Frances Perkins was the first ever female cabinet member, and she was the Secretary of Labor, who mainly focused on immigrants working in factories, and she greatly supported welfare and workers' right to unionize. And according to the video, she became like the symbol of the New Deal spirit. What was the Coalition of 1936? So this was mainly the bringing together of many European ethnic groups who hadn't been in the United States for very long and weren't treated quite as well as the people who have been here for a long time. And they were brought together to participate in politics because they hadn't very much in the past. And these people were largely people who really benefited from the New Deal legislation and the workers' new rights and unionization and everything. So they were the rising working class, and they were coming up, almost meeting the middle class Americans at this time. Who abandoned the Party of Lincoln and why? So it was mainly African Americans who abandoned the Party of Lincoln as a result of the New Deal policies and direct relief programs directly helping them, mainly in urban areas where people worked in factories as opposed to farms where it didn't help quite as much. And Eleanor Roosevelt was actually someone who really helped this because she reached out and she got out and talked to people and traveled around the country, kind of just supporting everyone in the Black community and making them feel more at ease with their political standing and working rights of that time. Now, what was the big deal? So, according to the video, they said it was largely that workers' environments had changed for the better because now they could stand up for their rights, and the big companies didn't have quite as much power over them because of unionization and the new workers' rights legislations. All right, and here are 3 of the New Deal acts that are still around today that I chose to talk about. So number 1 is the Social Security Act, and this is probably what comes to mind when people think of New Deal acts that are still around today because this is a very large part of our society and our government. And it's used basically in the same way now than it was back then, used to help relieve people when they lose their jobs, and mainly just to support people who have retired. And the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is used in, just as the Social Security Act, very similar to when it was created, it's used the same today, as a way of making a minimum wage for workers and limiting the number of hours they can work so they don't work too many, and making fair child labor laws. These have been adjusted over the years, and minimum wage has obviously risen with inflation and all that, but it's basically the same as it was. And last, the Soil Conservation Act, which was created as a way to prevent any new Dust Bowl from happening, because this regulated now the use of soil in the Midwest in large farming corporations, and they needed to make sure that they weren't overusing the soil so a Dust Bowl wouldn't happen again if a drought like that ever occurred again. So that's still in use today because that's still a very important part of farming, and that hasn't changed very much. You still need to rotate your crops like you did back then and make sure that you're doing everything right so it doesn't create environmental issues. Thank you!